Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm officially a content creator for Tacticus now, woohoo! Which means that I get to play around with things and go much more in depth than I would otherwise. As usual, if you need assistance with battles, strategy, roster development, etc., please find me and other helpful tacticians in the official Tacticus Discord. You can find a link to it in the description. Before we go into today's topic, if you find this useful, please consider using my Refer a Friend code shown in the bottom right. It helps me out a lot and shows me you're interested in the content I make. For today's video, I want to cover one of Tacticus' most hyped characters, Kariyan. Specifically, I want to walk through how his passive ability works, how his active ability works, and how they combine with other characters when paired with Trajann. Let's quickly peek at his skills, starting with his passive. After performing either a normal attack or active ability attack, Kariyan does an area of effect attack against all surrounding units, dealing 3 melee hits of power damage. However, if he is adjacent to an enemy big target, he will instead do one much bigger hit of piercing damage. The game does not specify which big target he prefers if he is next to several, and in my very quick testing done late at night, I couldn't find a pattern. His active deals 3 melee hits of eviscerating damage to an adjacent enemy, but with a twist. Both his active attack as well as the ensuing passive deal an additional 33% damage for each round, including this one, in which he attacked. So this means in round 3, if you've attacked and returned, he deals an additional 100% damage. On turn 6, it becomes 200%. You can see in both guild raids where you have 6 rounds and horde mode where you have more rounds, typically 10 plus, this can quickly get out of hand. Okay, so that was a lot of words, but why does it matter? Well, when talking with people on Discord, I've noticed a lot of confusion about how exactly Kariyan works, and because of all the hype around the Custodes in the guild raid meta, people are also confused how exactly Kariyan works when paired with Trajann. I'd like to clear that all up by walking through example attacks and explaining the behavior of what we see here. I guess we should also quickly talk about the other half of the equation, Trajann, specifically his passive. Let's go and check out Trajann's passive ability. If you have a unit that has used an active ability this turn and is adjacent to an enemy, then when that enemy is attacked, each hit deals a substantial amount of additional bonus damage. This is actually the biggest flat buff for damage in the game besides Warhowl, at least at the moment. Now, if additionally Trajann happens to be adjacent to that enemy, then not only does the enemy take additional bonus damage per hit, it also takes +2 hits from the first non-normal attack of the round. What is a non-normal attack, you ask? The easiest way to think of it is either an active ability attack or an attack triggered by a passive ability. We'll watch some footage to illustrate this in more detail. Speaking of footage, why don't we dive into it? In this first clip, we see how Kariyan's passive works. He will first do melee hits with his normal attack, and then will do an additional 3 melee hits with his passive ability. In the second clip, we can see how his passive works when he is adjacent to more than one enemy and none of them are big targets. We can see that he first performs a normal melee attack against his target, then hits all adjacent enemies, including his initial target with his passive, dealing 3 hits of melee damage to each. This clip shows how his passive works against an enemy big target. He'll first deal 3 hits of melee damage with his normal attack, but then instead of dealing an additional 3 hits of power damage, he deals 1 big hit of piercing damage. This next footage shows more of a niche scenario. Kariyan is adjacent to multiple big targets. He uses his normal attack, and his passive hits one of the big targets with piercing damage. We'll go through several rounds of attacks, targeting a different enemy each round. In some rounds, his passive hits the same target as his normal attack. In others, it hits a different adjacent big target. As I said, this is probably a fairly niche scenario, but just something I wanted to point out since it's not always obvious whom he attacks with his passive. This next clip shows how Kariyan's active increasingly buffs his attacks. The first thing I do here is attack a different unit to remove the buff from his rapid assault trait. His active shows us that he has yet to attack and thus would receive 33% additional bonus damage were he to use his active. With the Orc Boy out of the way, Kariyan then moves to attack a Volk whose health has been significantly buffed. Looking again at Kariyan's active, we see that it would deal an additional 66% bonus damage were he to attack this round. His passive can deal up to a bit more than 7,500 damage. In addition to his actives buffed, he also has the Beast Slayer trait, which gives him a further 20% damage modifier against Folk, who is a big target. This would give Kariyon's passive a theoretical max of 15,200 damage. Kariyan also crits with this attack, allowing us to deal over 15,500 damage with one hit. We then perform another normal melee attack just to show that when his passive triggers, it does not get the buff that he gets from his active ability attack. We'll continue to perform normal melee attacks while his active ability cools down. Remember, each round that we attack gives an additional 33% damage modifier to his active. We can see that when we go to use his active ability again, his passive ends up doing more than 25,000 damage. I hope that this footage has given you a better understanding of how Kariyan works in isolation. Now, I'd like to talk about how he pairs with other characters, in particular, Trajann. Trajann's passive ability triggers only after someone uses an attack from their active ability. Karn's passive, the Betrayer, is not an active ability, and therefore does not cause Trajann's passive to proc. We can see that here, when Kariyan then performs a normal melee attack next, and his passive ability is not buffed either. Remember, in order for Trajann to buff attacks, someone must first use an active ability. The order of those abilities matters. If Karn uses his active ability before Kariyan, we get suboptimal damage. We'll use Karn's active first, which deals 3 attacks, none of which receive additional hits nor buffs, because until the active completes, Trajann's passive ability will not proc. Next, we use Kariyon's active ability to increase damage, but we notice that Trajann buffs the active ability attack, giving him 5 hits of eviscerating damage instead of buffing the passive ability attack that would have given him 3 big hits of piercing damage. Let's start by using Kariyon's active. It will receive a damage modifier from previous attacks, but should still score 3 hits, none of which will be buffed. After his active comes his passive. This time it scores 3 hits instead of 1 thanks to both of Trajann's buffs. We then use Karn's active and see that the piercing attack is buffed with extra damage and 2 additional hits. And well, I wanted to show you that his eviscerating and plasma damage don't get buffed with the extra hits, only the damage, but these guys wrecked our poor Tyrant Guard punching bag. We'll see this though in another clip a little later. Kariyan slots in well to Dante's multi-hit raid team. Aun'shi is a stalwart of the multi-hit team, and people might start to think about how they could use Aun'shi, or rather his active ability, to refresh another's active ability most efficiently. While I'll leave that to other testers, I wanted to show this video, which demonstrates that Aun'shi cannot refresh Kariyan's active ability. The expected behavior probably would have been to remove the cooldown. I'm not sure if this is a feature or a bug, but at least we know that refreshing Kariyan can't be part of a raid strategy. Aun'shi cannot refresh Kariyan's active. We demonstrated how Kariyan and Trajann work together against a single enemy, but now let's see how things work against multiple enemies. As we know, Kariyan must be adjacent to enemies for his passive to hit them. Trajann must be adjacent to units for his passive to grant additional hits. Enemies must be adjacent to a friendly unit that has used an active this turn in order for Trajann's passive to grant additional damage. We start by placing both Trajann and Kariyan adjacent to Certus and Bellator. Then we use Trajann's active ability so we can proc his passives plus 2 hits. Then we attack using Kariyan's normal melee attack and area of effect passive attack, and see that the passive is buffed for both damage and hits by Trajann when used against Bellator and Certus. However, against Varro, Kariyan neither deals additional damage nor receives additional hits. This is because Trajann used his active, not Kariyan, and Trajann is not adjacent to Varro. Some people were concerned that because Karn can situationally perform a non-normal attack using his passive at the beginning of a turn, he would not benefit from Trajann's passive ability when using his active ability. But remember, Trajann's passive only starts to apply once the enemy is adjacent to a friendly unit that has used an active. In this scenario, we can see that Karn finishes off Varro, and then at the beginning of the next turn performs his passive attack against Tyrant Guard. The passive attack is not buffed because no one has used an active ability yet. Then, Trajann uses his active ability, followed by Karn, allowing the piercing damage from Karn's active to receive both additional damage and 2 additional hits. We can see that, as expected, only the piercing attack gains additional hits. Neither the eviscerating nor plasma attack gain additional hits, though they do gain additional damage. Alright, we made it. That was Kariyan in a nutshell. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it both useful and informative. I'll work on the entertaining part later. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Tech Priest Fred and Tacticus for showing me the ropes, and to Snowprint for accepting me into their creator program. With that, thank you so much, and see you in the next video.